Okay. Last week I talked about the importance of Easter and how Jesus' resurrection is the most important historical event to the Christian faith. Without our knowing about the resurrection and everything that led up to it, nothing would matter. What would have happened if Jesus was resurrected, but then nobody told anybody about it? What if the apostles never spread the word? It would have defeated the whole purpose. Once the resurrection happened and Jesus ascended to heaven, the next step was to tell the world what had happened. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, the Bible. When I was a kid, I never went to church and had never read the Bible. I had never heard that it was called the Word of God. I didn't understand that Christians believed it was ultimately written by God. I thought it was just a bunch of different men who didn't understand science like we do today, writing down stories that were proven to be factually inaccurate today. They didn't have electricity or telescopes or microscopes. But boy, was I wrong. I later found out that the Bible is the most amazing book ever. When I was 29, I was a fairly outspoken atheist. I had never seen anything supernatural or miraculous, and I was taught in school that we all evolved from ape-like beings millions of years ago. I certainly didn't believe in a 6-day creation by a supernatural God that I had never seen any evidence of. But then a friend of mine brought me a videotape to watch about young Earth creationism. I read the back of the box it came in and just laughed and said, "I'm going to pick this thing apart." I thought for sure I was going to be able to see through all his arguments and find all his errors. Well, I watched that first videotape and couldn't refute anything he said. I wasn't convinced of anything yet, but it started something in me that completely changed my life. Praise God. My friend brought the rest of the videotapes, 7 in all, and I watched them all more than once. This guy completely destroyed any possibility of atheism being true by using actual science, not just by quoting the Bible about everything. Now, I'm not going to get into all that stuff now because that's not what this sermon's about. I highly suggest you look at my other videos and find the ones called The Proof of Truth on Facebook or Hovind Express on YouTube and watch them yourself. You need to find out how much stuff you currently believe about where we came from that's just not true at all. But this sermon is about the Bible. Those videos forced me to believe that the Bible was actually right about where we all came from. Darwinian evolution was totally impossible, which means somebody created us. And there was definitely a worldwide flood, and that's where the fossils came from. So if the Bible was right about creation, I had to investigate if it's right about everything else, like that Jesus guy. I looked into all the various world religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, Wicca. I looked over most of them, but the only ones that matched up with what I had just learned about creation and the flood were the 3 big ones, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I quickly threw out Islam after 9/11, after reading about where it came from and how Allah is actually just a moon god. Go research that if you don't believe me. And then I just had to figure out if Jesus was really the Jews' Messiah or not. Oh boy, is he. Even while I was still unsure about Jesus in November of 2003, but I was absolutely sure about God the Father being the creator and the flood of Noah being real, I gave in to a preacher on TV and said a sinner's prayer along with him. I then talked to God for over an hour. I don't remember anything I said except that I knew I wasn't going to be able to change overnight. But boy, was I wrong. From that moment on, I was a changed person. My best example is that I naturally just stopped swearing. My mind would just automatically find a clean word to use instead of a dirty word. I wasn't trying, it just happened. A lot of other things changed about me too, but I won't get into all that here. A couple of months later, I started downloading a lot of Christian teaching recordings. I would just listen to this stuff literally all day, just about every day. I couldn't get enough of it. It's like I was going through a self-imposed schooling for the Bible without the possibility of ever getting a degree. But I learned so much during that time period that completely solidified my faith in the Bible. I eventually became convinced that every single letter of the Bible came from God and not just man. It wasn't just one thing, it was a whole bunch of things altogether. First of all, I already believed in the Bible's creation story, but then I found out about some other stuff. I think the next thing was called Bible codes. Not a lot of people know about this stuff, but it's very real. I don't want to get into a lot of details here, but this phenomenon completely amazed me and ultimately proved to me that the Bible was written by a supernatural origin. There's no way mankind could have written a book that also included all these Bible codes, not even if they had computers. I hope I've at least intrigued you enough to look into what I'm talking about. My Facebook videos called The Proof of Truth, near the end of the playlist, and my YouTube playlist called Why I Believe in Bible Codes has all the data you need. Please take the time to watch them. It's truly mind-blowing information. Okay, then partially linked to the Bible codes are all the fulfilled prophecies of the Bible. I never knew that the Bible had a 100% track record concerning prophecy. Jesus fulfilled all the Old Testament prophecies about the coming Messiah, 100%. The statistical chances of that are beyond astronomical. No other book in the world, especially all the other religious books, show the same kind of supernatural construction as the Bible. The Bible alone stands out as being the only miraculous book in existence. Therefore, it needs to be paid attention to. But wait, it gets even better. For several years, I had plenty of faith in the original Hebrew and Greek manuscripts that eventually led to our English Bibles today. But I was under the impression that all the English translations were flawed in one way or another. That's what I was taught, anyway. I knew that all the modern ones, like the NIV, had some serious problems that I won't get into here, but I also thought that the KJV, the King James Bible, which was translated hundreds of years ago, also had some problems. I was taught that none of the English translations are perfect. But then I listened to the arguments from the people who believe in the KJV. It turns out that the KJV is the only translation that anybody ever says is perfect. Nobody's an NIV onlyist. I've heard people say they prefer the Geneva Bible, which came before the KJV, but they never claim they think it's perfect. Only the KJV has people who claim it's perfect. Are they on to something? Or does it in fact have any errors in it? I spent a lot of time back in 2011 and 2012 looking into all the claims against the KJV. All of their claims either say that there is some kind of factual error, such as 2 + 2 = 5, or else they say it should have been translated differently. Those are two very different things. Well, after looking into a whole bunch of supposed errors, there's always a good answer, and it turns out not to be an error. For instance, 1 Corinthians 10:8 says that 23,000 people died in one day. But Numbers 25:9 says 24,000 people died. Seems like a factual error, right? But 1 Corinthians 10:8 says in one day. Numbers doesn't say that. Therefore, if you think about it, 23,000 died in one day and another 1,000 died the next day. It's not a factual error. You just have to read it carefully. Now, for their claims that it should have been translated differently, that's only a matter of opinion, not of fact. They make these claims based on looking at Hebrew and Greek dictionaries today, which I have to point out to you are not absolutely perfect and inerrant, and then using those man-made definitions to claim that the KJV shouldn't have used a particular word. Again, that's just an opinion. And while I can't find any factual errors in the KJV, that makes me think that maybe God made sure the KJV translators did a perfect job, which would mean also they used the right words. Here's some more things to think about that made me gain even more confidence in the KJV. The Bible itself says that God would preserve His word. Did you know that none of the originals still exist anymore? Everything they have today is a copy of a copy of a copy. How then could God preserve his word if only the originals were perfect and we don't have them anymore? A lot of those copies that they have don't match each other either. So how do you know which one is right? God is pretty powerful, right? He can speak a universe into existence. He can design the human body. And he can inspire his prophets to write down exactly what he wanted them to write down without any error. Don't you think a God that powerful could also make sure the people who copied his word would do it right? Don't you think he could even make sure the people who translated it also did it right? And as even more food for thought, the KJV wasn't even the first time he did it. Most people have no idea that Jesus read a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures called the Septuagint. He didn't read the original Hebrew. I'm sure he could read Hebrew, but every scholar knows that when Jesus quoted the Old Testament, he was quoting from the Septuagint translation, not the original Hebrew. Now think about this. If the Septuagint was just a flawed human translation, would Jesus be okay with that? Back then, Greek was the common language of the whole world. I'm pretty sure that God made sure the Septuagint was translated perfectly so that Jesus, along with the rest of the world back then, could read his word. So now fast forward to the 1600s. God knew that English would eventually become the common language of the whole world. But it wasn't yet in the 1600s. He had a king order the translation of his word into English. God works through kings. The KJV was first published in 1611, but it had some printing errors which eventually got corrected. In 1769, the authorized version was finally published, which is a perfect KJV that we still have today. But wait, there's more. Here's another thing. Every other English Bible today was translated from the same set of manuscripts that came from two guys in the 1800s named Westcott and Hort. They're called the Codex Vaticanus and the Codex Sinaiticus. It can be proven if you do the research that those manuscripts were very corrupt to begin with, and also that those two men were very questionable and even believed to be into the occult. They were corrupt men using corrupt manuscripts, and they produced corrupt results. Every English Bible today comes from them. But the KJV alone has a unique origin. No other English Bible comes from the same texts that the KJV came from. The KJV translators used the right ones because God made sure they had the right ones, and it produced an inerrant Bible. And one last thing I'll point out is this. Only the KJV Bible is not copywritten. Every other English Bible has a copyright, so the publisher gets their money. The love of money is the root of all evil. So, I know that some people have a hard time with the Old English in the KJV, but to be honest, it's not that bad. Yes, there's a learning curve to find out what all the weird words mean, like ye and thou and repenteth. But you learn them and move on. They're not that difficult. So let's review. The KJV Bible is a completely unique, statistically impossible, miraculous book that absolutely has to be written by our Creator. He gave that book to humanity so we would know the truth about Him and His Son and how He wants us to behave. It's literally like our owner's manual. Some call it the Bible, the basic instructions before leaving Earth. Once you discover how miraculous this book really is, and you get to know it and obey it, it'll change your life for the better entirely. Those with faith in the Bible and a repentant heart even have the power to perform miracles. The things that Jesus did back then, we can still do today. The belief in supernatural healing and casting out demons is laughed at by the world today, but I've done both a lot. And the only reason I can do it is because of my faith in the Bible. Please, fall in love with this book. Let it change your life like it changed mine. Search for righteousness instead of sin. Sin won't be worth it, I promise. God bless you all.